The installation process itself is quite simple. Let's start with installation requirements. Linux, unlike Windows, supports many different file systems. Windows supports the two types, NTFS and FAT32. The Windows operating systems can be installed on the NTFS file system only. Linux, on the other hand, can be installed on any file system. But it's advised to do it on partitions based on ext3, ext4, riserfs, or so-called BTRFS file systems. The first two, especially ext4, are the most common file system used to install Linux. Theoretically, the system could be installed on different partition types, but due to the limitations of file systems such as FAT or NTFS, Linux requirements will change, and there can be a problem with the handling of certain characters, or user rights. These file systems are not really designed for this purpose, so you should avoid trying to install Linux on these two types of partitions. The Linux system can be installed on virtually any kind of hard disk. Of course, standard restrictions for a given drive apply as well. In the case of the large hard drives, regardless of which operating system we install, there may be a problem with booting the operating system. For large disks, larger than 1 terabyte, in a situation where the operating system is installed in the 2nd terabyte and further, it gets increasingly hard to boot. This limitation does not come from the operating system, but it is a problem resulting from the restrictions of BIOS, which is the basic system installed inside the computer that initiates the operating system. This issue will appear for both Windows and Linux-based systems. Of course, today's managers, for example, Grub2, an application which de facto runs the operating system, can partially overcome this problem, but it is risky. If the computer has the UEFI instead of BIOS, we can work around the problem by creating the partition in a specific way. However, it's recommended to create a small partition, about 100 megabytes, maybe 500 megabytes for complex systems, at the beginning of the hard disk, for the purpose of storing the kernel of the system itself. When this is done, the system applications can reside in any place on the hard drive, even beyond the 1st terabyte. The system starting up from the beginning of the disk is able to easily load itself, and it starts referring to the rest of the operating system only after loading support for large hard drives. In fact, the same mechanism is used in Windows, and its installer should create at least 2 partitions on the hard drive. One is small, about 100 megabytes, the partition containing the kernel, or at least a part of the startup files and drivers, and the rest of the system is installed on the other partition, which the user sees as Drive C. In the case of a parallel installation of Windows and Linux on a single computer, usually it's recommended to install Windows first and Linux second. This is due to one simple fact. The Linux system is able to detect all other operating systems during installation, both Microsoft and third-party, and prepare the starter application in such a way that each operating system is visible in the selection list. Unfortunately, the Windows Startup Manager only adds Windows-based systems to the startup list. That, of course, excludes the possibility of adding a Linux system. You can, of course, add a Linux to the Windows Boot Manager, but it's a very complicated operation. Therefore, it's better to install Windows first and Linux later. The installation process is pretty intuitive. If someone had installed a Windows system, he or she won't encounter anything surprising during Linux installation. The only things you need to remember are a few key differences that I spoke of earlier in this presentation. An average user can usually accept the default installation values. That would let him or her install the operating system correctly, without the risk of losing external data. The only thing you need to pay attention to is the way of setting the system clock. Although most installers detect it automatically, it's good to pay attention to it. The Linux system can also read the time set in our computer in two ways, either directly from the BIOS or from the BIOS modifying it by a certain shift. If the UTC option is selected during installation, system time is read directly from BIOS. It causes the following issue. If you start Windows and then you start Linux, in one of these systems, the time is shifted by 1 hour or more. If in turn you change the system time in any of the systems, it will be modified by the same value, but in the opposite direction on the other system. This gives rise to problems. If the UTC option is not selected, Linux considers BIOS time as the determinant and uses it as the basis for calculation of system time. The system calculates the correct time by itself, so there's no conflict between Linux and other operating systems. Most installers deselect UTC option if they detect a Windows installation. And if they don't detect another system, they leave the option selected. Anyway, we should pay attention to that, because after the installation is completed, it's hard to change the time options. Most distributions also suggest simple login for other users, and some suggest an identical password for the user and the system administrator. This is not a very reasonable solution, and we should pay attention to that option, depending on what kind of environment the computer will be used in. Whether we want users to have direct access to it after startup or not. This is a safety aspect, which the user does not necessarily have to choose. It's also suggested to create a special partition for our home directory. Because if you need to reinstall the system, or if you change the distribution to another, for example, from Fedora to OpenSUSE, or vice versa, having a separate partition will let you preserve all user settings. If you do that after reinstalling the system, there's almost no need to configure the settings, desktop background, window appearance, as all settings are taken from the previous installation. This option is also useful when we're testing a number of different Linux systems on one computer. We can isolate a root partition for each operating system, and then hook up our home partition to each of them. We may just run one operating system at a time. But when we switch to a different system, our files and settings are automatically transferred. It's very important that you always create a separate user account and secure them with strong passwords. Accounts should be separate and different than the administrator's account. Almost every Linux installer enforces this upon the user. Unfortunately, Windows systems do not do that, and leave more holes in security that way. Sometimes this may even lead to a situation where you have a separate administrative account, unprotected by a password, and once the installation finishes, any user has full access rights without a password. This is a major breach in security. In the case of Linux, during installation, at least in the popular distributions, we always have to provide an administrative password, and only then create dedicated user accounts for daily work. Some distributions, such as Ubuntu and all its variants, go a step further. In that system, there is no such thing as an administrative account. At most, a normal user can be added to the administration group. When it's necessary to perform certain administrative operations, such a user is asked for his password. It's very safe, and as long as the password is kept secret, unauthorized users cannot perform administrative tasks. I strongly recommend the KDE environment to novice users, because it's very similar to what they had contact with when working on Windows. GNOME is an interesting environment, but it introduces a lot of different kinds of information that do not necessarily help to grow sea legs if the user is accustomed to certain behaviors. For example, right-click doesn't work in GNOME, and users often want to use it. It's the reflex that you want to right-click an item and get the drop-down list of actions. It can be confusing to many and even to experienced users.